Hello everyone, this is Mr. Tilley from Perryfields High School. I'm not sure whether you're aware, but Tuesday the 12th of May 2020 was actually International Nurses Day. And this was obviously an opportunity for us as a nation to thank the wonderful nurses of the NHS for their dedication, commitment and indeed bravery in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. Tuesday the 12th of May though was also the 200th anniversary of the birth of a famous lady called Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale is a lady on the right hand side in front of you now. Many of you will probably have heard of Florence Nightingale through work either you've done at school or indeed through news reports in recent weeks. We know that obviously new hospitals have been built in order to take on the COVID-19 pandemic, and these new hospitals were named after Florence Nightingale, and there's one in London, one in Birmingham, one in the Northwest and so on. The lady on the left hand side is a very important lady in the history of nursing, and her name is Mary Seacole, but I bet many of you probably haven't heard of this lady. As I've alluded to, both of these women were vitally important in establishing modern nursing as we know it today. So why is it that we know so much about Florence and so little about Mary? So what I'd like to do today is really put that right. So what we're going to do today is look a little bit more at the background of these two ladies and what they actually did to develop nursing as we know it today. You may be surprised to learn that the high admiration we have for nurses and the medical profession hasn't always been evident in society. Today, we quite rightly think of the nurses and NHS staff as heroes, as dedicated professionals who are skilled and brave in the face of a horrible pandemic, COVID-19. If you went back to the early 1800s though, nursing was viewed in a very different light. Hospitals were often dirty and filthy, and nurses weren't particularly well trained. In this picture you see before you, which was drawn in the early 1800s, you get a very clear indication of what people felt about nurses at that time. The nurse is sat on a chair and she's sleeping while the patient is suffering in the bed and being effectively neglected. There's also a glass to the side of the woman or nurse, which would indicate or imply that she's been drinking on the job. So again, this was a job that people didn't aspire to, that people didn't respect. So what happened? How did modern nursing come about, this profession that we respect so much today? Well, this was down to the two ladies that I showed you at the start of the presentation, Florence Nightingale and Mary Seacole. So what I'm going to do is start by looking at the contribution played by Florence Nightingale, and then we'll compare that and contrast that with Mary Seacole. Florence got her name from the city where she was born in Italy. However, she was brought up in this country and she came from a very wealthy family. Now, like other girls that came from wealthy families, she was expected to find a suitable young man, to marry and to have children. She wasn't expected to go into the world of work, but Florence had very different ideas about her life and her future. Very unusually for the time, she wanted to work, she wanted to have a career, and she believed she had a calling from God that she was to help other people. And to this end, she wanted to become a nurse. Now, her parents obviously were not very enamoured or happy about this idea, and as we saw on the previous slide, nursing wasn't really a respected profession at this stage. Indeed, most Victorian hospitals were filthy and dirty, and nurses weren't trained. Despite this though, Florence was determined to fulfil her dream, and she managed to get into various health facilities and hospitals in order to find out more about the profession. She even managed to convince her parents to fund a trip to Germany, where she could go to a German school for nurses and female teachers in order to learn more about the profession. On her return to this country in 1853, Florence was offered the job as a superintendent at a hospital for women. The Crimean War was fought by Britain, France and Turkey against Russia between 1854 and 1856. Thanks to the invention of the telegraph, reporters who were based out in Turkey were able to send back to England many reports about not only the battles but also the conditions the soldiers were living in. And the Times correspondent William Russell was able to provide up-to-date and very vivid reports of these conditions, and the British public was scandalised and horrified by the reports of the treatment the wounded soldiers got in some of the hastily erected hospitals, particularly in Scutari near Istanbul in Turkey. This picture shows the hospital at Scutari near Istanbul. At this hospital, soldiers were left lying on bare floors. There were no supplies of any kind, and they had no more than one meal a day, if that. There were no lavatories or sanitation, and no nurses or bandages. Men were left to die in great pain without any medical attention. Florence was asked to bring together a team of 38 nurses who would go to support soldiers at a military hospital in Turkey. This was the first time women were allowed to serve in the army. Now, the male doctors at the hospital weren't very happy, as they didn't really like the idea of having women around. However, they eventually had no other choice but to give in, as they desperately needed the help, and they let Florence's team get on with their work. Upon arrival in Scutari, Florence quickly set her team of nurses to work. This is a picture which shows you the improvements that she made to the hospital. As you can see, it's light, it's airy, it's clean. Every soldier has their own individual bed, and there are plenty of supplies of medicines in the cabinets. And more importantly, there is a nurse or nurses attending the needs of the soldiers. However, despite the best efforts of Florence and her team, lots of soldiers lost their lives during the Crimean War. More than 4,000 soldiers died during the nurses' first 4 months in Turkey. At first, Florence thought that the high death toll was down to injured soldiers not getting the nutrition they needed. The British government sent out a sanitary commission to investigate what was happening at the hospital where Florence was working, and it was soon discovered that the hospital had been built on a sewer and the soldiers had been drinking contaminated water. The system was improved and the hospital flushed out to make it cleaner. This eventually led to a fall in the death toll. After the Crimean War ended in 1856, Florence was desperate to find out exactly what had caused so many deaths. With Queen Victoria's support, Florence helped to set up a royal commission into the health of the army. She tried to make sense of the data on the deaths of soldiers during the war. The results were far from expected. 16,000 of the 18,000 deaths weren't because of war wounds, as Florence had first thought, but it was actually preventable diseases that were the culprit. In 1859, Florence published a book called Notes on Nursing, which helped educate the poor on how they could best care for their sick relatives and neighbours. She later used a large sum of money Queen Victoria had actually gifted her to found the Nightingale School of Nursing, which was the first facility of its kind. Those who trained at her school were sent to hospitals all over the UK and helped spread Florence's new ideas. Florence became the first woman to be awarded the Order of Merit for her service when she was 87. She died at the age of 90. At the start of this presentation, I said that there were two women who played a pivotal role in the development of modern nursing as we know it today. One of those was Florence Nightingale, the other was Mary Seacole, who you see in front of you now. Mary Seacole was born in 1805 in Jamaica. Her mother ran a boarding house for sick soldiers, and Mary would help her mother to care for those patients. In 1854, she went to England and told the British government that she was willing to go out to the Crimea as a nurse, but they rejected her, not once, but 4 times. Now, your average person would probably have given up after the 4th attempt, but not Mary. She was a very resilient character, and she made her own way to the Crimea at her own expense. Once she arrived in the Crimea, Mary set up her hostel. This was basically a place where soldiers could go to buy medical supplies, food, drink and various other things, and she actually named it the British Hotel. In addition to this, she would frequently ride out onto the battlefield in order to tend to the wounded soldiers, and this was something that Florence Nightingale never ever did. During her time, Mary actually met Florence on 3 occasions, but not once did Florence actually ask Mary to join her nursing team. When the war came to an end in 1856, Mary made her way back to England. However, due to the way in which the war ended, Mary was now bankrupt. Fortunately for Mary, the Times newspaper and Punch magazines had been aware, or were aware, of the work that she'd done in the Crimea, and they decided to arrange for 4 days of public festivities in order to raise money for her. In addition to that, Mary wrote her own autobiography, The Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole, and through these 2 activities enough money was generated to ensure that Mary could live out the rest of her life relatively comfortably. Unfortunately, after Mary's death, she was largely forgotten about for almost a century, but she has subsequently, I'm glad to say, been recognised for her work in the field of nursing. A memorial statue of Seacole was erected in 2016 in her honour in the grounds of London St Thomas's Hospital, which is where the Prime Minister recently underwent treatment for COVID-19. And at that time it was believed to be the first memorial statue of a named black woman in the United Kingdom. So in summary, at a time when we are quite rightly thinking about and thanking the brave and heroic nurses on the front line of the NHS who are battling against this horrific pandemic and COVID-19, I think it's only right and proper that we also spend a little bit of time thinking about and reflecting on the work of 2 inspirational women who were pioneers in the development of modern nursing as we know it. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation today. Obviously, keep watching. There'll be more presentations next week. Until then, stay safe and thank you for watching.